Ladies and gentlemen, imagine loving someone with your whole heart, only to slowly lose yourself in the very person you trusted most. Imagine a marriage that looks perfect to the outside world, yet quietly erodes your confidence, your voice, your very sense of self. Today, we are going to uncover the hidden truth about marriage to a narcissist, a journey through charm, control, and emotional manipulation that leaves deep, invisible scars. But this is not a story of defeat. It is a story of survival, courage, and the powerful reclaiming of the self you thought was lost forever. Love rarely collapses in a single moment. It fades, shifts, and reshapes itself so quietly that you don't realize anything is wrong until you're standing in the middle of it, confused and unsure of how you got there. When love slowly turns into confusion, it is because reality is no longer shared. It is being rewritten. What once felt safe and certain begins to feel unstable, like walking on ground that moves beneath your feet without warning. In the beginning, everything feels aligned. Words match actions, promises feel solid. But over time, small contradictions appear. A kind gesture is later denied. A hurtful comment is brushed off as a joke. An agreement is forgotten, yet somehow you are blamed for remembering it incorrectly. These moments seem insignificant on their own, but together they form a pattern that erodes trust, not just in the relationship, but in your own perception. Confusion becomes the new normal. You start questioning your reactions, your memory, even your emotions. You replay conversations in your head, searching for clarity, wondering how love, something meant to bring peace, has become a source of anxiety. The most painful part is that nothing appears obviously wrong from the outside. There is no clear villain, no dramatic turning point, just a growing sense that something feels off, yet you cannot name it. This quiet rewriting of reality is what makes the experience so destabilizing. Love doesn't vanish, it mutates. It becomes conditional, unpredictable, and emotionally disorienting. You begin adapting to the confusion, thinking it's part of commitment, part of maturity, part of love itself. But real love does not require you to abandon your inner compass. When reality is altered slowly, confusion feels like a personal failure rather than a warning sign. Yet it is not weakness. It is the natural response of a heart trying to make sense of a story that keeps changing. And while that confusion is still settling in your chest, another truth quietly unfolds. Because when reality has already begun to blur, the next phase feels almost inevitable. Narcissistic relationships rarely begin in darkness. They begin as fairy tales, intense, intoxicating, and full of promises that feel larger than life. You are not just loved, you are idealized, chosen, made to feel extraordinary. And when a love story starts that high, no one expects the fall to be so disorienting. At first, the attention feels like devotion. The intensity feels like passion. You mistake emotional urgency for emotional depth. But slowly, the magic starts to change its shape. The affection becomes inconsistent. The warmth becomes selective. Praise turns into comparison. And the very person who once made you feel special begins to make you feel uncertain about your worth. This is where the fairy tale quietly fractures. There is no sudden villain reveal, no dramatic ending. Instead, the story rewrites itself page by page. You find yourself working harder to get back to the beginning, chasing the version of them who once adored you. And because you have already begun doubting your reality, you assume the distance must be your fault. If love has changed, you believe it's because you failed to protect it. But this is the hidden trap. The idealization was never meant to last. It was a hook, not a home. And when the admiration fades, it leaves behind confusion, longing, and self-blame. You grieve not only the relationship as it is, but the dream of what you believed it could be. The most painful part is realizing that the fairy tale wasn't destroyed by time or hardship. It was never real in the way you thought. And yet, your feelings were real. Your hope was real. Your love was real. The illusion may have faded, but the emotional impact remains, asking you to make sense of a story that promised forever and delivered doubt instead. And as that illusion dissolves, another layer reveals itself, one that is far more subtle and far more dangerous. Because when the fairy tale ends, you don't meet a monster, you meet charm. Control does not arrive with shouting or fists on tables. It arrives with a smile, with calm certainty, with a tone that sounds reasonable enough to make you question your own reactions. This is how control hides in plain sight. It sounds like concern when it questions your choices. It feels like protection when it isolates you from others. It presents itself as leadership, confidence, even strength. And after the intensity of the beginning fades, you may welcome that certainty, mistaking it for stability. You think, at least someone knows what they're doing, at least someone is in charge. But slowly, decisions stop being shared. Your preferences are dismissed as impractical. Your independence is reframed as disloyalty. And when you resist, the charm turns strategic. You are not attacked, you are persuaded. Guilt replaces force. Disappointment replaces anger. Silence replaces confrontation. Because a narcissist doesn't need to overpower you, they just need to make you feel small enough to comply. And here is where the earlier confusion deepens. You are not being told what to do. You are being led to believe it was your idea all along. Boundaries are crossed with such grace that objecting feels unreasonable. You start apologizing for things, you don't fully understand. You shrink yourself not because you were demanded to, but because it seems easier than pushing back. From the outside, this control looks like a strong personality. From the inside, it feels like losing ground without knowing when the battle started. You still remember the fairy tale version of them, so you excuse the behavior. You tell yourself they mean well. You tell yourself this is just how relationships evolve. But love that requires surrendering your autonomy is not love, it is management. And charm, when used to override your voice, is not kindness. It is control wearing a pleasant face, slowly training you to trust their authority over your own instincts. And once that control has settled in, it begins to work at a deeper level, quieter, more invasive, and far more damaging. This is where gaslighting takes root, not as a dramatic lie, but as a steady drip of doubt that slowly dissolves your sense of self. It doesn't demand that you believe a false reality outright. It simply asks you to question your own. It starts with small things. A conversation you remember clearly is suddenly never said. A boundary you expressed is labeled misunderstood. Your emotional response is dismissed as exaggerated, irrational, or imagined. And because the control before it was wrapped in charm, you want to believe there's a reasonable explanation. You assume the misunderstanding must be yours. So you ask questions, not of them, but of yourself. Did I hear that wrong? Am I remembering this correctly? Why do I feel so upset if nothing really happened? Each question seems harmless, even mature. But over time, those questions stop being tools for clarity and become weapons turned inward. You begin editing your memories, softening your feelings, minimizing your pain before it ever reaches the surface. You stop trusting your emotional responses because they are consistently invalidated. Gaslighting doesn't erase your identity all at once. It chips away at it. It makes you unsure of your judgment, your instincts, your emotional intelligence. And when you no longer trust yourself, you rely more heavily on the person who is confusing you in the first place. Their version of events becomes the anchor, even when it leaves you feeling lost. This is how identity erodes, not through force, but through uncertainty. You become hesitant where you were once confident, quiet where you were once expressive. You start seeking permission to feel, to think, to react. And the cruelest part is this: you are not losing your mind. You are responding to a reality where truth is constantly shifting beneath your feet. When every disagreement ends with you doubting yourself, self-trust becomes collateral damage. And without self-trust, even your own voice begins to sound unfamiliar. And when your voice has been quieted and your sense of self has been blurred, something else begins to happen, something far less visible, yet deeply wounding. Emotional neglect. CT settles in, not as cruelty, not as open rejection, but as absence. A slow, aching absence where connection used to live. You are still there. The marriage is still there. Conversations still happen, but the emotional bridge between you begins to crumble. Your feelings are met with indifference. Your pain is acknowledged, only long enough to be dismissed. You stop reaching out because every attempt feels like speaking into empty space. This is what makes emotional neglect so devastating. There is nothing to point to, nothing to prove. No raised voices, no obvious harm, just the constant experience of being unseen. You share something important, and it is met with distraction. You express hurt, and it is met with logic instead of empathy. Over time, you learn that vulnerability leads nowhere, so you pack it away. And the silence grows. Because when you no longer trust your own perceptions and your emotions are repeatedly invalidated, you begin to believe they don't matter. You convince yourself that needing emotional connection is weakness. You lower your expectations, telling yourself this is adulthood, this is marriage, this is normal. But inside, something is starving. Emotional neglect doesn't attack you, it abandons you. It leaves you carrying your pain alone while still being legally, socially, and emotionally bound to another person. You can be married and profoundly lonely at the same time, and that loneliness cuts deeper because it has nowhere to go. What makes this damage so lasting is that it teaches you to disappear from your own inner world. You stop checking in with yourself. You stop asking what you feel, what you need, what hurts. You function, you survive, you perform your role. And while no one can see the wounds, they shape everything: your confidence, your joy, your sense of worth. Because being ignored emotionally does not just hurt your heart, it quietly convinces you that your heart was never important to begin with. And after living in that emotional emptiness for long enough, you begin to notice something terrifying, not just the loneliness, but the absence of yourself within it. The loss is no longer just about connection with them, it is about connection with who you used to be. This is the hidden cost that rarely gets named. Not the arguments, not the heartbreak, but the quiet disappearance of your identity. You catch glimpses of it in small moments. You hesitate before answering simple questions because you're no longer sure what you like. You struggle to make decisions without second guessing yourself. Passions that once energized you now feel distant, almost belonging to someone else. You remember who you were, but that version feels far away, like a photograph from another lifetime. This loss happens gradually, shaped by years of shrinking, adapting, and silencing yourself to survive. When your emotions are ignored, your reality questioned, and your needs dismissed, you learn to prioritize peace over authenticity. You become skilled at being agreeable, low maintenance, invisible. Not because you want to disappear, but because it feels safer than being erased again and again. What makes this so painful is that it happens while you are still functioning. You show up, you care for others, you meet responsibilities. From the outside, you look capable and composed. Inside, you feel hollow, as if parts of you have been placed on a shelf and forgotten. And yet, even in this loss, there is an important truth. You did not lose yourself because you were weak. You lost yourself because you were trying to survive in an environment that did not allow you to exist fully. Self-abandonment became a coping strategy, not a character flaw. The real tragedy is not that you changed, it that you were never given the safety to remain whole. But what has been buried is not gone. Identity can be reclaimed. Voice can return. Awareness of the loss is not the end of the story. It is the moment the story begins to turn back toward you. And even as you begin to sense that something precious has been lost, you don't immediately leave. That is another truth people often misunderstand. Awareness does not always lead to escape. More often, it leads to silence, shame, and a loyalty that keeps you rooted long after the ground beneath you has cracked. You don't speak because you don't think anyone will understand. How do you explain a pain that has no visible proof? How do you describe a marriage that looks blay but feels suffocating? You worry that if you try, your words will sound dramatic, or worse, ungrateful, so you carry it alone. Shame whispers that if you were stronger, smarter, more secure, this wouldn't be happening. It convinces you that the loss of yourself is a personal failure rather than the result of a harmful dynamic. And once shame takes hold, silence feels safer than exposure. Then there is loyalty, the most complicated anchor of all. You remember the beginning, you remember their potential, you remember the moments when they were kind, attentive, almost loving, and those memories bind you. You tell yourself that leaving would be betrayal, that staying is proof of commitment, that endurance equals love. You protect them even as you feel yourself disappearing. This loyalty is not foolish. It is rooted in empathy, values, and the belief that people can change. But in a narcissistic marriage, loyalty is often used against you. Your compassion becomes leverage. Your patience becomes permission. And the longer you stay silent, the harder it becomes to imagine a life where your voice matters. You learn to minimize the damage, to normalize the pain, to explain away the emptiness. And because you've already lost so much of yourself, the idea of leaving feels like losing everything. But silence is not strength, it is survival. And loyalty, when it requires your self erasure, is no longer noble, it is costly. The truth waits quietly beneath it all, patient and persistent, asking to be spoken before you disappear entirely, and eventually even the strongest silence begins to crack. Not because everything suddenly becomes unbearable, but because something inside you starts to wake up. It might be a single sentence you hear, a story that sounds too familiar, or a moment of clarity when you realize you are more exhausted than afraid. This is where awareness begins, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a quiet light turning on in a dark room. For the first time, you stop asking how to fix the marriage and start asking what it has cost you. This shift is subtle but powerful. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated incidents. You recognize that the confusion, the self doubt, the loneliness were not random flaws in you, but responses to something deeply unhealthy. And with that recognition comes something you haven't felt in a long time, a sense of grounding. Awareness doesn't mean anger right away. Often it begins with grief. Grief for the years spent shrinking. Grief for the version of yourself that learned to be quiet. Grief for the love you kept trying to earn. But within that grief is power, because once you name the truth, it stops owning you in the shadows. This is the first act of reclaiming your power, not by confronting them, not by explaining yourself, but by believing yourself again. You start trusting your instincts even when your voice trembles. You allow yourself to think thoughts you once pushed away. You let the truth exist without immediately defending it or minimizing it. And in doing so, you step out of the fog. Awareness does not demand immediate action. It simply asks for honesty. And honesty, after years of self-abandonment, is radical. It interrupts the cycle. It loosens the grip of shame. It reminds you that you are not imagining your pain. When you see clearly, even quietly, you are no longer powerless, because clarity, once gained, cannot be taken from you. It becomes the foundation upon which everything else begins to rebuild. And as that clarity settles in, something remarkable happens. You feel the urge to speak, not to accuse, not to convince, but simply to tell the truth. This is where healing truly begins. Not in grand declarations, but in the quiet courage of saying, even if only to yourself at first, this is what happened to me. For so long, the truth lived locked inside you, tangled with doubt and fear. Naming it feels almost dangerous, as if speaking it might make it more real. But the opposite is true. What has been real all along finally gets air. And when truth is spoken, even softly, it starts to loosen the hold of confusion and shame. You may begin by telling your story in fragments, a sentence here, a moment there. Each word feels heavy, unfamiliar, yet strangely relieving, because for the first time, your experience is not being minimized or corrected. It is simply being honored. Speaking the truth reconnects you to yourself. It affirms that your pain erode, that your confusion made sense, that your survival was not imagined. And as your voice grows steadier, something inside you begins to knit back together. The parts of you that went quiet start listening again. This act is not about blaming or seeking validation from the person who hurt you. It is about releasing yourself from the burden of carrying it alone. Truth-telling shifts the weight. It transforms your story from something that happened to you into something you understand. And in that understanding, healing takes root. You stop hiding from your own memories. You stop questioning whether you are allowed to feel what you feel. You begin to integrate the experience instead of fighting it. The truth no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a guide. When you speak your truth, you step out of isolation. You make room for compassion, your own first, then others. And healing doesn't rush you. It unfolds at your pace, grounded in honesty. Because once the truth is out in the open, it no longer has the power to trap you in silence. And once the truth is spoken, once the silence is broken, a final and most profound realization emerges. You are not broken. Not really. Not in the way that matters. For so long, everything in the marriage may have whispered that you were flawed, that your needs were too much, that your feelings were invalid, but surviving that experience does not make you weak. It makes you human, resilient, and deeply wise. The journey through confusion, idealization, control, gaslighting, emotional neglect, and self erasure leaves marks. Yes, but those marks are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of endurance, of navigating a reality that demanded more from you than it should have. They are proof that you cared, that you loved, that you tried, and that you survived when others might have given up. Understanding this truth allows you to stop framing your past as shameful. You begin to see that the difficulty was never a reflection of your inadequacy, it was a reflection of the imbalance around you. You were responding to a life that required constant adaptation, and surviving it required courage, intuition, and extraordinary emotional labor. And with this awareness, you can reclaim your life in ways that feel authentic. You can set boundaries without guilt. You can listen to your own instincts without fear. You can nurture yourself the way you deserved to be nurtured all along. Each act of self respect, each moment of choosing your own well being becomes a declaration: I am here. I matter. My voice matters. The hidden truth about surviving a narcissistic marriage is that the greatest transformation comes not from leaving the other person behind, but from finding yourself again. The heart that once felt small can expand. The voice that once hesitated can speak. The self that once disappeared can shine. You are not broken. You were surviving, and now finally you are beginning to live. And so here we are, standing at the edge of a truth few dare to speak, a story so often hidden behind closed doors, smiles, and quiet endurance. What we've explored today is not just about marriage to a narcissist, it's about survival, resilience, and the journey of reclaiming a life that was quietly stolen, piece by piece, over years. It's about understanding that the pain you felt was real, that the confusion you experienced was justified, and that the self you thought you lost is waiting for you to remember it. But this is not the end of your story. It is the beginning. Because once you know the truth, once you have named it, and once you have faced it with courage, you gain something more powerful than anger or resentment. You gain clarity. You gain the chance to rebuild your life on your terms, to trust your own instincts again, to honor your own feelings, and to embrace the kind of love and connection that does not demand your disappearance. Your journey may feel overwhelming at times. It may feel lonely or frightening, but every step you take toward understanding, toward speaking your truth, toward reclaiming your boundaries, is a step toward freedom. Every moment of self compassion, every choice to prioritize your own well being, every whisper of hope that says, I deserve better, is a triumph over a system that tried to convince you otherwise. And here is the most important truth to carry with you: the light at the end of this journey is not someone else's validation, it is the rediscovery of yourself. It is the knowing that despite everything, despite the heartbreak, confusion, and doubt, you are whole, worthy, and capable of living fully. So stay with me to the very end, because the story doesn't just close with survival, it opens with liberation. The real triumph is waiting for you to step into it. Your life, your voice, yourself, they matter, and it is finally your turn to embrace them fully.